Welcome to the Embodiment podcast. This show is for you if you see the body as more than a brain taxi. It's for people interested in coming home to the body as a holistic aspect of who we are and how we live. Episodes contain practical tips, exercises you can take away, and interviews with embodiment specialists from around the world. I'm your host, Mark Walsh.
Hello, my name is Maud Raber. I'm a somatic coach, and today I have the pleasure of interviewing Mark Walsh for the 100th episode of the Embodiment podcast. Hi, Mark.
Hello. The tables have been turned for this one, haven't they? So you're interviewing me.
How's that for you?
It's cool. I get interviewed quite a lot for other podcasts anyway. I think one thing that inspired me to do a podcast was getting interviewed actually by Brooke Thomas. So I'm used to being on the other side, though it's weird kind of the setup, doing it the other way around. So I know you know my work, so I'm interested, what kind of juicy questions you ask.
Okay, hopefully they're juicy enough, else you can always prompt or give other hints. So I'm not going to ask you about Brexit or anything like that to start with.
Anything you want, go for it.
Okay, cool. So hopefully, so obviously this is something you've already shared in the podcast, and I still wanted to hear a little bit about it from you. We all have an embodied life story, right? So a pathway of life whereby your whole mind, body, and soul have traveled and taken you places and made you who you are. So basically, what is your body a testimony of today? What do you?
So I normally begin, don't I, by sort of saying, how did you get interested in working with the body with people? The very first episode where I talk about, I think it's what is embodiment. I also talk about my personal story, but I was kind of like doing it again and again and again on different interviews, because I think we construct meaning through making sense and making narrative out of the chaos of life. So I never mind kind of telling it in different ways. Often I tell the story of failure. So often the story I tell is that I was very clever cognitively as a child. I was from a family of teachers, lots of books on the shelf. And then I found myself miserable, suicidal, drug addicted, broken-hearted, and failing in life skills, particularly my driving test. Sounds like a small thing, but it's quite a big thing at the time. I found myself for the first time in my life experiencing failure, because I'd always been very good at school, and that was what I was told mattered. I would regard revising for a test as cheating, because I could easily pass the test without doing that.
So mind smart, right? You were intellectually very great. Exactly.
So I was cognitively very smart, and IQ tested in the top 0.01%, I was told. And also, coming from a family of teachers, there was books around and things like that. And I just thought that was all there was. And then I had this experiences of massive failure on a number of levels, from the practical to the romantic, the spiritual to the physical to the emotional, which we perhaps now see as all part of embodiment. And I went, well, what the fuck is going on? There's something up here. There's a part of the education system that's been missing. And another thing I've realized in therapy fairly recently is that I had a really bad time at secondary school, because even though I was pretty smart, I did not get on with the teachers. It was very controlling, and it was an environment where I felt deeply threatened, existentially threatened. I couldn't be myself. I couldn't be. And it's always given me a certain sympathy for people that I work with who have that same existential threat. But I realized I traced it back to just being in school and realizing this was a place where I couldn't be me. So I think that was at the root of it as well, was seeing some just really fucking bad teaching, just abusive and over cognitive teaching without taking the human being into account, and that just being really painful. And I think at some level I went, I can do a better job than that, and there's more to education. I'm going to find out what that is. And that started the quest. So when I went to university at 18, I really crawled into university. I was broken physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually. I was really, you look at pictures of me at that time, I'm this alcoholic, speed addicted, very thin, wide.
Also quite romantic, right? You look like Dead Poets Society, pretty much.
Yeah, I used to write a lot of poetry, and I still do. But I was very much caught in the sort of noble sacrifice of the artist kind of archetype. And I was just miserable. And I was just looking for something else. And that's, when I walked into an Aikido dojo, And it just made sense to me. I looked at it, I saw the relationship to power and movement. I also had a very practical reason to be interested in martial arts, in that I was selling drugs at the time. And I kind of, that puts you in a few edgy situations. And I wasn't much of a fighter. I was this sort of skinny, fey poet. And people might find it hard to believe I was quite camp, So I had this practical and spiritual necessity. So that began the journey for me. And at that point, I just quit being interested. I didn't even go in the library for the first 6 months of being at university because I had zero interest in cognitive learning at that point.
Do you remember any other key moments in your embodiment pathway, your own pathway of getting more acquainted to your whole person?
A big one for me was actually falling in love. This is just before I found Aikido. And it also is how I hit kind of rock bottom, was that I was with this beautiful girl called Sally, who is still a friend. And she's just long dark hair, elf-like creature. Her mum was a Buddhist that had studied mindfulness, and she'd sort of picked up this kind of mindfulness thing from her mum before anyone knew what that word was. She didn't know what the word was, and I certainly didn't at the time. And she just moved differently, and I liked it. And now it's basically someone that was just more in their body. And I remember I was in the woods by my sixth form college, which is like high school, and I kissed her in the woods. It was like first kiss, and I had this transcendent experience of the sort of sunlight as the sun was going down, sort of coming through the trees and going through me, and a sort of disillusion of self. So it's like an oceanic, mystical experience. And the first time we had sex a few weeks later, which is when I lost my virginity, I definitely had that. I mean, it was like an utterly transcendent situation. I just thought all sex was like that. It's like, had sex with a second person 6 months later. That was an experience of really sort of the profound opening that's possible through emotion and the body, was those sort of love and sexual experiences with her. So that was one. And then when we split up, I really was brokenhearted and came down hard from that, because it's like you're 17 and I was 17 and had seen the face of God, and then had to go back to the classroom. It just didn't make sense to me. I didn't get what that experience. I thought it was personal to her. I didn't get that was a transcendent mystical experience until years later, when I went, oh, it's not about her. I was just heartbroken. I thought it was, this girl. I realized that's a universal experience of deep somatic opening that can happen naturally during music or sex or these kind of things. Like now it's much more part of my daily life to have a sort of at least mild versions of that experience. But at the time it was a hell of a come down. There was others, like I often talk about the experience of being in an exam, and an exam on stress management where the theory of stress management didn't help. So I'm in psychology at university, right? But I'm like doing an exam on stress management. And I'm going, hang on a minute, I'm stressed about this exam because I was going to get thrown out of university for doing my work. And I go, hang on a minute, the theory of stress is not helpful at this point. And then I use like keto exercise, like a brief centering exercise, which is now, part of what I teach daily. And I went, oh, that helped. And I think that was where I got the distinction between learning to do and learning about something that our culture really lacks. That this is why, business people think that you can learn about being a leader, but actually it's a skill set. And then, more ontologically later realizing there was a way of being that I was attracted to in the Aikido world, which developed over time through practice, and again wasn't something you could get from a book.
Yeah, the practice you just mentioned, which was centering, I guess, is one of the key practices that you teach now. And one of your friends told me you had a moment of using it very powerfully once in a car accident. What exactly did you do, if you remember that?
I've had a few extreme ones with centering. I mean, I've done it in war zones with guns to my head. This was just before I turned my life around, which was some years later. So I was doing Aikido, but I was still kind of drinking and didn't really have any meaning in my life till a bunch of years later. And I was driving a car. I wasn't drunk, but I was pretty suicidal at the time. And I overtook a lorry. I took a risk that really was a bad risk on the kind of country roads where I was. And I rolled I actually had to swerve off the road to avoid an oncoming car. And I rolled in this bean field at like 70 miles an hour. And the car was a complete write-off on every side of the vehicle was crushed except for what's called the survival space, which is where I was as the driver. It's a well-designed vehicle. It's French, actually. And I wouldn't be alive without good engineering. But also that experience, as the car was rolling, it kind of went into slow motion, and there was glass falling around me like kind of snowflakes. The glass in cars goes into these little cubes when it smashes, and they're falling around me, and I can kind of feel them bounce off me in slow motion. And at that point, I sort of thought, well, I might as well center now. And I think that, I walked out of that car with little more than scratches, though I actually had an imprint from the steering wheel on my hands because I was gripping it so tightly. And, the ambulance people said, you are really lucky to be alive. The police were kind of angry with me because I was being casual about it. And they were like, look, you should have died today. There was another time a good friend of mine, I was training Embodiment at Strozzi Ranch, and that was a big part of my training. A few years later, and I got called back for the funeral. Like, a really close friend of mine, my best friend at university, had killed herself, and I was asked to kind of help out a little bit with the funeral arrangements and be there for people and sit with her family. And that's something no one should ever do, is talk at their own child's funeral. And I was able to regulate myself enough to get through the weekend. And afterwards, I still didn't have much skill with emotional intelligence. I, went full into grief and alcoholism and things afterwards, but it really kind of proved it to me, a mixture of working in the war zones, that car crash, the grief experience. And I went, there's really something in this, because when the shit hits the fan, which it will for all of us, it will sooner or later. Like, I'm having a real good year this year, but sooner or later, shit's going to get bad again. You need this stuff, and it proved to be effective for me. And I also saw, I just saw a difference. I saw people like Paul Linden and went, okay, you are consistently loving. Or, I'd see Richard and he'd be consistently charismatic. Or, you just see it and you go, okay, there's something going on here. And that really inspired me to kind of keep. I started with Aikido, but that was a martial art. And then I was doing psychology at the time, so it was natural to put the two things together. And I started reinventing the field of somatics before I even realized it existed. And, I have to understand the internet's only just invented at this point, right? So it's very difficult to Google stuff. And eventually I realized there's a few people out there from the Aikido world, like Thomas Crum and Paul and Richard and various other people, Wendy Palmer, who were doing stuff already with this. And I was kind of reinventing the wheel. And then I realized that Aikido is cool, but I can't make a living from throwing people around. And most people are not going to do martial arts because it's too demanding. It's too rigorous to, we do like classes where you walked on your knees for 2 hours. I mean, the average person just isn't going to do that. So I realized, like, in order to A, support myself financially, and B, help more people, I needed to expand this. And also, Aikido doesn't have everything. I started to go, well, what about language? So I looked at nonviolent communication, or looked at Fernando Flores' linguistic system, or I say, what about emotions? Like, they're not covered in Japanese martial arts. So what about music? What about sexuality? My Aikido teacher doesn't really talk about that. So I started dancing tango and doing other stuff. And then it spread because I realized what I was most interested in was not fighting. What I was most interested in was body-mind psychology. And while Aikido had been a great gateway to that, I do not fetishize Aikido now. Like, I'll be training Aikido tonight, but I was dancing Fire Rhythms the night before. I'll be doing yoga tomorrow. My practice schedule is much broader now. So Aikido for me, like Sally, was kind of my first love, But I went through the Aikido disenchantment and out the other side of that.
What are the things that you're seeing yourself do consistently now after, say, 15, 20 years of embodied practice that were not possible at the beginning?
Well, no longer drug and alcohol. That's a bonus. I'm no longer suicidal. Yeah. My mood is consistently good. I have a consistently good mood, not all the time, obviously, but I'm generally happy and grateful. I won't say that I never get angry or irritated, because that is still, I think, a core part of my character, particularly when there's kind of shadow stuff involved. But I've definitely got that more under control. There's a far greater ability to be intimate. Like, my relationship with my wife is very good. And previous to me, my wife had a couple of good relationships as well with wonderful girlfriends that are out there. And I kind of, that would have been unimaginable. There was no way I could have had a girlfriend and being genuinely close to someone. It's hard to separate out what are the skills that I learned from embodiment and what is just growing up, because it's been 20 plus years, right? So
out of life, right?
Yeah, I mean, just a lot of life in that time, and also I've had a lot of experiences. It hasn't been 20 years doing nothing. So it's hard to know what's just life experience, but I'm pretty sure the meditation and the yoga and the Aikidos had a part in some of the more, I mean, I have some skills that are unusual. Like I had there was a guy called Don Levine, and he used to pay me just to come into meetings with him to look at the other people in the meetings. And I remember he said, you're off this. I remember once we were with this African dictator in, I won't say what country, but in Africa. And he just, my job was just to sit there and kind of read this guy and look at this guy and kind of feel into the situation and then report to Don afterwards. Or like, my wife got into bed after playing poker at 4 a.m, like a few nights ago, and she lost. And I knew she lost immediately by the way she was breathing. And bear in mind, I was asleep. And I saw I kind of woke up and went, "Oh, I'm sorry you lost." Like, how much money did you lose?
Kind of superpowers, right?
Yeah. So there are. They're not magic and they're not 100% reliable. Like I still fuck up and get people wrong. But there's a few skills like that which are just, they're not normal skills. They're things from embodiment.
So you've mentioned some of your most influential teachers. Who would you say played a key role in your life, and what have you learned from them?
Paul Linden's been my main mentor for the last 10 years, and he, really is the master of centering and looking logically and rigorously at these practices rather than in what I sometimes call a dolphin fucking way or a Californian way. And so really I learned those two main pieces from him, but really what I still aspire to in him is this consistently loving presence. Like that's a really impressive thing about Paul, not his knowledge or his wisdom. In terms of working with language and the leadership piece, like the business leadership piece, Richard Strozzi Heckler, like I spent a bit of time with him, and he was my first mentor for my first year of running business. So I should talk to him every month. And we're, like lots could be said there. And, mostly what I have there is just gratitude though, but he really started the field of leadership, embodied leadership, and is still, master of that field. So yeah, he's definitely been a big influence. This guy called Don Levine was the guy who introduced me to all these people. So Don Levine was the head of an organization called Aiki Extensions, which was all about getting Aikido off the mat. And I'd accidentally got in contact with him because I was going to Cyprus because my sister was getting married there, and I Googled Aikido Dojo Cyprus, and he was looking for dojos because he was about to do an Aikido project with the United Nations there. And I ended up, and like him and Richard were running this project, and they had no time because he was like professor of University of Chicago, used to be Barack Obama's boss, if that gives you some idea. And yeah, I've got Barack Obama's personal email from before when he was a senator. And I dared fucking look at it in case the CIA come around. But anyway, so he was a big deal, Don, playing quite high ball politically. And he just took me under his wing, even though I was just like this fuckwit kid that didn't know anything. He just saw something in me and just provided opportunities for him. And from him, I just learned, like, his work ethic was insane. Like, I worked pretty hard, but Don would get up at 7 a.m, be doing Aikido and work all day. And at midnight, I'd have a bath because I'd be staying in his house. And he'd come and sit in the bathroom and like be asking questions about what we were doing the next day. And I'd be like, Don, it's fucking midnight. We've been working all day. We've been done 3 hours of Aikido. It's like, he was just like, he was in his 80s and would drink, and he just had a real passion for life and a great work ethic. And he also politically really understood the sort of machinations of the world. He was this sort of wily old Jewish professor. So yeah, I definitely got a lot from him. And he was the one that really opened the doors to meeting all these other people through this United Nations project, where I became almost kind of like a kind of Aikido secret agent, where I would have to sneak across borders and find people that didn't want to be found and kind of find Aikido dojos. And I was doing all this research for Don. And that was the beginning of a very interesting few years, because Don sent me around the world. For 3 years, I went to Brazil, Ethiopia. He sent me to Strozzi. He sent me to Paul Linda. And, he sent me on various projects like I can't talk about here, because some of them are a bit delicate. But it's just like that really opened my life up.
That's also obviously the period where you got into war zones and in contact with harsher realities.
Yeah, so I always had this urge to find the sharp edge of things. You know, like since I was a kid, you know, as a kid, I wasn't sure if I wanted to be an assassin or a gangster or a soldier or something like that as a career. And I had this urge to find the hard edge things, which was slightly trauma related. I now understand. It's kind of a little bit of repetition compulsion. I'm much more. So as a child, I remember I was camping with my school and a tent blew up. Someone had left a gas canister in the tent with an open flame, and the gas canister we used for cooking had blown up, and everyone ran away from the tent, but I ran towards it. And even at the time, my friends, we were like 10, my friends were like, Mark, that's not normal. When things blow up, you run away from them, not towards them. And to this day, I mean, I love a good fight. I love causing trouble. And that going towards that, which is dangerous, has always really intrigued me. And sometimes that edge is like a spiritual edge, like doing a Zen retreat, which is, you know, terrifyingly difficult, you know, a solitary meditation retreat. And sometimes it's been very visceral and physical. I found myself drawn to work in areas of conflict, and that had an unhealthy side at one point. And eventually I got pretty burnt out and traumatized from it. You know, I saw some bad stuff, and it's also had a healthy side. You know, I still do a little bit of work in that area, whether it's, you know, teaching soldiers in the Ukraine about trauma education, or, you know, I've been to various places now, Afghanistan, East Africa, West Africa. I lived in the slums of Brazil, which was actually the worst in many ways. So it's, you know, it's some bad times, but also I kind of learn how to work on the edge, which gives a certain credibility, and also means that wherever I am afterwards, I can be kind of like, well, it was not that bad. You know, it gives a sort of confidence. And when I go to those places where I train aid workers, like I've trained Oxfam or Save the Children or War Child, like I can talk to those people because I get their experiences, and you know, I can share, well, there was this one time, you know, and then you trade war stories until they trust you, you know. So yeah, I still like edges, though these days I'm a married man, and I, you know, kind of a bit more safe, and I don't do so much crazy shit anymore.
You recently shared how some of your almost limitless energy also comes from passion, of course. So why does it really matter so much to help others to be embodied? Why does it matter? I
mean, I've always had, like, for me, a life without purpose wasn't worth living. And I was, you know, genuinely suicidal. 3 members of my family have killed themselves. So it was a real option for me. It was a real, like, possibility. And, you know, my cousin who I was raised with, older cousin, killed himself, who was like my kind of hero. So I kind of went, okay, this is a real possibility. And then I went, well, if I'm not going to do that, I need a really good reason. I need purpose. I need a strong reason to not kill myself. And confronting death that way, and through the war zones, and existentially through meditation on Aikido, and kind of, for me, just clarifies purpose in life and meaning. Now, it's not like a big, for me, it's how can I put this? Enlightened selfishness. It's just like a life of meaning and purpose is just so much better than a life of not. And I've done the hedonism. You know, I lived above a nightclub in Brazil. I slept with a beautiful Brazilian girl, probably twice a day. You know, like I've done all the drugs. I've had all the sex. It's not like I haven't tried hedonism as an alternative route. But hedonism is, and this is the story of the Buddha actually as well. I'm not that I compare myself to Siddhartha too much, but like there's this idea, and you see this in St. Augustine and others, that like most people think that they'd only be happy if they had more pleasure. And I've done that. So once you've done that, where do you go? You know, and I think contribution is the only other place. I mean, you can either go deeply inside, which is totally valid. And I suspect I'll end up a monk like my mum was a nun, but I think the only other valid choice is a path of contribution, because that's what's satisfying. And that's what leads me having a great life. So I find it energizing. So why not?
So what are you a commitment to in this life?
Spreading embodiment as not just as an idea, but as making embodiment available to the world. And, you know, my life's mission is spreading embodiment to the world. And, you know, our YouTube channel has 13 million hits. Now, you know, I want that to be 100 million. You know, our podcast, I want to get 100 million downloads. I want to train 100 trainers to be better than me. Like, you're going to be better than me as an embodiment trainer within 10 years. There's no doubt about it. I'm not talented. And like there's people like Marcin and Vilja who are already at that level. And it's like, okay, if I can train 100 embodiment trainers to be better than me, and I'm pretty good, but I feel like there's more potential out there, then that helps. And then there's the online stuff. And then there's, different ways. There's lots of different ways I do the same thing, basically through yoga. I love embodied yoga principles to be available at every yoga studio in the world. And that's completely possible before I die. In the same way as now, say acro yoga is pretty much available everywhere now. So, there's plans, and these are not just big ideas. These are things that, I have a 20-year plan for my own personal growth in terms of like a training plan. Like we have business plans that are 5 and 10 years. This is normal for me. And why not? Why not aim big, right? Like, why not? Like, if you do something meaningful, and I think embodiment is one meaningful thing. I don't want to get too like evangelical. There's like lots of meaningful things out there that are worth doing, and this is just one that appeals to me. In some ways, it's just like pick a team and support them. Like it's like choose a husband, love them, shut the fuck up. Like it's the same with a career, and on one level. And on another level, this is the only thing that ever resonated deeply for me. Like I'm fucking ruined, Maud. I couldn't get a proper job. This is the only thing that for me kind of makes a lot of sense. So, yeah, I'm too late for anything else now.
You've deliberately set aside the next 5 years of your life in order to deepen your embodied practices and learning. What specifically are your learning intentions there?
So basically, I realized I was competent at what I do, and I get pretty good feedback, but I realized it's the next level. And the field of embodiment is pretty big in that it encompasses kind of 6 main areas of influence, and getting good at one of them can take 3 to 5 years. And I've got some grounding in a couple of them, like martial arts and yoga and meditation. And I realized, like, if I really want to develop myself as an embodiment trainer, then there's a couple more that I need. And it's just not possible to train at the level I want. I think it's very difficult when I have a family, which I hope to have in the future. And it's very difficult running a full-time business. So I'm just cutting back my business massively to do that. Like, part of it, it's kind of like George Leonard. I'm curious, like, what is human potential? Like, what is possible with this? Because we live at a time where the availability of embodiment practices is second to none. And also now I have the financial resources, I have the network, I have the framework of understanding to be discerning. And there's nothing more exciting to me than, like, what does that adventure look like? So I want to spend the next 5 years doing intensive training in various things like Feldenkrais, body psychotherapy, different kinds of body work, yoga, more yoga, various other intensives. I'm going to start with 2 months of meditation in Nepal with a teacher who's highly recommended to me. And then, I want to spend 15 years running an embodiment center and practicing after that to really put the hours in. And there's very few people in the world who've done anything like that. Bonnie Bainbridge Cohen would be one. And there's many, and I'm really curious where the upper limits of this stuff is.
Yeah, I deeply appreciate it. I really want to underscore the commitment here, which is one of the things that inspires me. But even before going there, obviously you've already done quite an impressive job over the last, let's say, 10 to 15 years of integrating the learnings of various somatic methods. And you've built all of that into a multi-perspectival approach, and also a simple set of principles for working with the body. So what's the key value of this? What's distinctive about that?
Yeah, that's new. So in terms of this field, if I could claim anything, I wouldn't claim to be the sort of most embodied person. That would be laughable if you put me, next to sort of some of the big names, or the deepest into a particular approach. I'm not the best Aikido teacher who ever lived or anything, by far. However, what I've been pretty good at is integrating and seeing how things fit together, and drawing out from the many approaches a set of principles which can be used creatively and dynamically by different people. So we sometimes call that EFC, which of course you've been on, about our big trainer course. We call no guru method, in that there's always 2 lead teachers who are very different. Frankie, Vilja, myself, and Rachel are all very different. And that difference, plus the fact that we bring different things to the table, and we have guest teachers, and we show students how to work creatively, not just photocopying us, mean, that original idea came from Paul Linden's centering algorithm, and then I just extended the idea. And that's pretty new. Like, I feel like a truly integrative embodied approach is pretty new. Like, most people are coming from a very strong bias, like in terms of they're a martial artist or a yogi or a dancer, just to name three of the main areas you can come from. And that leads to a huge bias, and also cultural bias. You know, like the Californians are massively culturally biased, though they don't see it generally. The Japanese or the Koreans or the Asians are massively culturally biased. And like for me, like, you know, I've spent 6 months or more in, I think, 8 different countries. You know, I'm from an immigrant family. I have a wife from another country. I've been learning different languages. I think a cross-cultural perspective on it's also new. So they're the things that I think I've added to the field so far, is the kind of truly integrative approach.
Let's say in an hour or so you get hit by a bus or a dolphin or whatever you'd like, and you've got like basically 1 hour to live. What are the 1 to 3 principles you would teach someone who wants to work with their body?
I just go back to bed with my wife. You know, I've got enough stuff on the internet. You know what I mean? I feel like the basic algorithm of awareness and choice is the kind of really key one. And, you know, if people get that, they can work with it in different ways. You know, basic centering is always a powerful tool. But I mean, my resources are already out there. You know, I put everything out for free on the internet as I don't hold back. So I kind of feel like at any point, if I get hit by a dolphin, then, you know, if I get drowned by a mean dolphin, then it's kind of okay. Like, people can look at my ebooks and all the rest of it.
Do you have a sense of a legacy that you want to transmit? If you think of a one-line epitaph, what would you like it to be?
I don't think I'm there yet, but I have more like those goals I talked about in terms of the specific practices. If we look at it at the 11 vision, I would like my grandchildren not to understand what my job is because it's no longer relevant. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And you often said that you dream of making embodiment commonplace. And one of the areas where you've brought that successfully is the business. So I wanted to talk a little bit of that as well, like bringing the body to business, bringing the business to the body. When you look at the current state of the world, how far are we in doing that?
I mean, my initial motivation to work with business was just that they had some money and I didn't have any. And I could see that most embodiment teachers were broke, and that really limited how powerful they were and how much time they could spend on charity projects, etc. And I only saw a couple of exceptions to that, and I thought that looks like a nice life. My other big motivation was it looked like a real challenge because business is generally quite disembodied. It's not a place where you're encouraged to feel, but neither is education. It's not a place where it's easy to feel and really be human. You know, there's this idea of the human resource, the objectified body in business like elsewhere. And that was upsetting to me. And also the part of me that likes a challenge was like, okay, let's fucking do it. Like, I wanted to do embodiment where people said it wasn't possible. So for the first 5 years of running a business, I just deliberately went after all the hardest clients. So it was police and military and NGO is tough, like non-profit sector is tough. So it wasn't just business, but business had the money, so that paid for everything else. So there's a kind of Robin Hood principle at work there, you know, including paying myself, you know, and then being able to have time to do other projects, which I kind of have a nice ecosystem, a nice balance between things now with that. So in terms of business, I think business has got better. Mindfulness has really helped. I hear a real openness to it. And I also think that, like the rest of the world, business is on a collision course with reality. Like, we can't keep going at the brutality and speed and dehumanization that we're going now. We can't keep doing that. Like, all my clients have got busier. It's just getting stupid, Maud. And I'm fast and I'm smart. I work hard, and I'm thinking, if I can't keep up with modern life with all the tools that I have, what chance has the average muggle got? You know, it's not going to happen. So I think there's a real collision course, and it's going to be interesting to see which way it goes. But on the whole, I'm pretty positive because I feel like people are realizing that inhumanity isn't sustainable.
In that context, do you have a sense of how it's possible to make embodiment not just the latest gadget on sale?
Yeah, I mean, business has a way of not just business, but I'd say consumer culture is more of the issue than business particularly. I certainly, I meet lots of really good people in business, so I don't want to demonize that world, far from it. Yeah, I think there's a risk. I'm following hashtag embodiment on Instagram, and that's absolutely breaking my heart how the word's being used. It's a misuse of the word in the same way as yoga's been kind of commodified. I see the same thing happen with embodiment, and maybe that's just the world we're in. Yeah, so I feel like real quality always does shine through, and there's always a place for quality, and that's okay. I think there's a real risk that mindfulness or embodiment or anything else just is used as a band-aid, or is simply making the problem worse by sort of being enabling. So enabling is this term from addiction recovery. If you look after someone who's alcoholic, you actually just make their alcoholism worse, because then they use you as a crutch, And I feel like there's a real risk that we could be enabling if we're not like actually deeply challenging some of the core things. So when I work in business personally, I always like to kind of say, you know what, yeah, I'll do a stress management workshop, but the problem is you've basically not got enough staff, or you're dehumanizing your staff, or, the leadership aren't actually embodying what you want other people to do. And that's bullshit. Like, I feel like unless we have courage, like I'm always really prepared to lose a client. I don't mind at all. I can always find more work. It's never a problem for me. So I think unless we're courageous and we're prepared to sort of speak truth to power, ask the hard questions at the very least, then then that is a potential issue. But I think if we can do that, we can be part of something a bit more positive.
In my experience of your work, you're also known by your students as a unicorn slayer. So what are the worst new age crap you're actually killing in your work currently?
Oh, really? We want to go there? So unicorns are trending now, Maud. Unicorns are like fashionable.
I know.
I actually think that's quite interesting psychologically what's going on. I think it's to do with the retreat to fantasy, essentially, that's going on. And also the unicorn is this huge phallic object, right? It's like a horse, which is a masculine phallic object with a cock on its head. So I feel like it's also the repression of masculinity. This is my very deep analysis of the unicorn trend. But for listeners, we specifically use the term unicorn as jargon for New Age jargon. So a unicorn would be like, I think a lot of the narrative about energy is frankly delusional. And people really need to take a look at what the fuck they're talking about with that, because most of the time it's really delusional thinking. And even high-level integral people I've challenged on this, and it takes me about an hour to break someone's heart when they're talking about energy, and it's hard work because we have a lot of attachment to it, and there is some real phenomenon going on. Like I'm not saying the phenomenon that's under that umbrella is nonsense, but far from it. There's other phenomenon, but I just don't believe how that's usually presented, and that upsets a lot of people. A lot of people are really attached to having magic powers. They really want magic powers, and I think the magic is in the humanity, not in the the special abilities, the electricity coming from your fingers, like Darth Vader or something. So I think that's one. I mean, just bad instructions. I mean, I always joke to my students that I ruin yoga classes for them. And I ruin most yoga, and they laugh, and I go, no, really. So like 90% of yoga classes, I can't go in anymore just because it's just too irritating to hear a non-operational language, Paul Linden would call it. So not giving instructions, not giving methods and how. So you'll hear that, like, the sort of worst ones. You still sometimes hear things like empty your mind. It's not doable instruction. There's no method there. So that's one of the biggest ones. I've kind of got past this, though. I mean, it's something I teach students as a kind of hygiene factor, just to be a good teacher, because I believe in having standards, and not any old bullshit is fine. And that's where we move beyond the kind of Californian pluralism. We can move beyond that into actually having standards. So I'm not like triggered by it in the same way as I used to be. I just feel like we've established a set of standards now.
Yeah, Mark, going back on this, seems to me that it's not just a superficial, teaching style difference that you'd have with somebody else. It's also a matter of values, right? What are the key values that drive your work as an embodied trainer?
Yeah, I mean, I think we could talk about stages of development and looking at embodiment through a number of lenses, like into an integral model, for example. So one would be a fundamentalist lens on embodiment, which is my teacher says, Iyengar says, Osenso says, using authority as the guide. And that's still a major influence on many, many embodiment teachers, subtly or less subtly. And I just don't buy that. I don't think truth comes from power. Yeah, that makes sense. And then the modernist values, I think, are under-integrated. So this is like using logic and reason and evidence, and this is all Paul Linden stuff, for example, which I feel like is tremendously under-influenced. And I'll say to a yoga teacher, they'll say, this is the best way to stand. And I'm like, well, let's see, let's test it. Or I'll say, well, for what, And then I think those pluralist kind of, an integral model, it's the green meme, the pluralist values of sort of sensitivity and they're all good actually, because it's important to be feeling and to be creative, though they're usually overdone, because that's embodiment from the baby boomers, particularly the Californian baby boomers. It was different waves of embodiment. There's the Central Europeans around the Second World War. Then there was the main ones that have been an influence of our generation will be the baby boomers, who have a certain cultural bias, and they were heavily influenced by this kind of slightly hippie kind of way of doing things. And then I think there's a higher level that's possible, which integrates multiple perspectives and genuine sensitivity, but integrates that with logic and rigor, evidence base, and also traditions. So it does honor the traditions. It just doesn't it's just not fascist about them. When I go to Aikido, I bow and I say onegashimasu. I use Japanese. It's fine to honor the traditions. I just don't think that Aikido is the one ultimate martial art that it may claim to be. So yeah, I feel like this is a difference in development, and I feel like this second generation that are coming through now, of which I'm kind of on the lead edge of that second generation. I'm sure some young upstarts will turn up soon and create a third generation. I feel like that's different and new. And some people still want the gurus and the baby boomers, but they're all dying out. They might not like it because they're desperately clinging to power, the vast majority of them. They're unwilling to pass from kings to elders because of the nature of their generation. But they're dying out. So, there's this sort of, my generation are going from young upstarts to being in the positions of authority. And it'd be interesting to see what changes in that. And then there'll be another generation of young upstarts that think my embodiment's terrible and want to improve it, which is great. So, I feel like that's just the way generations go,
In my opinion, one other key contribution that you've made is helping embodied practitioners to market themselves, so basically to bring their work to people, up to the point that Paul Linden, one of your masters, calls you his marketing sensei. So what are the biggest shadows, the biggest blocks that you're seeing in the professionals that you work with?
Yeah, so I regard myself as basically competent at marketing. I don't regard myself as expert in it, but being, having one eye in the land of the blind is a big advantage. And the only reason I'm still in business after 10 years is because I could sell this stuff, right? And you can't help people, which is, a key value for me is like, are you using this to help people? If not, why the fuck are you doing it? Like, if you're not, you can only do that if you can pay the rent. And I've certainly, even on a deeper level, when you can easily pay the rent, there's like an ease and a creativity that comes through. It can be generous is what I find. And I think that's a big shadow of the baby boomers. They're really reacting against business, and, money is bad, capitalism is bad. We see that from the left now, because most people in embodiment are coming from the left politically, or, the hippie generation, if they're older. They were just, vast majority of them were just broke. And they'd either live their lives with no money, just really struggling, or being hobbyists, or it'd go the other way and they'd get really shadowy about money and end up being really greedy money grabbers. And I don't think people say that about me. I think generally, people would say I was pretty generous. I like to give bonuses when there's, when we do well on a training. And but also for me, it's like, if you can't market, you can't get things to people. Like, even if you're trying to give it away, so you still have to convince people to come, even if it's free. I got 173 people paid up on Paul Linden's latest online course. That was fantastic, and they're all happy customers. So I feel like, I did this piece on like marketing is love. So marketing is just telling people who are hungry that you have a sandwich. That's a kind thing to do. You're saying like, look, you're hungry. This will stop you being hungry. It's called a sandwich. Would you like it? Like, there's nothing fundamentally wrong with marketing. And I just realized I had to teach that to my students, because all the courses I did never included how to sell it. They were just like, here's the skill. And I'm like, yeah, but I need to sell it to practice the skill, to keep doing the yoga or whatever. Like, 90% of yoga teachers that do a yoga teacher training never become yoga teachers because they can't make a living from it. So that's a really unintegrous model, if you ask me. They're selling yoga teacher training and 90% of them will never make any money from it.
So ethical marketing, ethical relationship to your work, basically.
Yeah, basically just efficacy and ethics. I'd regard not learning basic marketing as deeply selfish and unethical. It's like, who the fuck do you think you are that you won't get your work out to the world assuming it has some value? It's like, really, I just turn this over. I say marketing's about meeting human needs. Marketing's about telling the truth, finding your tribe. I turn the sales funnel, I call a trust funnel, because that's what it is. I have whole models for this to make it palatable to my more hippie students. But, I really turn it over. I just say, if you're not doing this, why not? Like, this is essential.
So, Mark, you've mentioned contribution. This is one of your key drivers for bringing this work to the world. In my opinion, you've also built through your YouTube channel, through the Embodiment podcast, a kind of a set of the commons, if you want, of embodiment. So this is the 100th edition of this podcast.
Crazy, huh? Isn't it crazy?
Yeah. So what does this mean to you?
Oh, well, first of all, I'm really loving the podcast right now, much more than other channels like YouTube, which I'm on. I'm checking the Libsyn figures, which is like the data on it, like every day, like twice a day. I'm obsessed with it, finding the best guests. And I had a great conversation last night. I'm literally doing another one after this. After this call, I think the fact that 100 has snuck up on us is mental. Like, that has happened in a very short space of time. I've got friends who've been podcasting for 2 or 3 years and not done that. And partly that's just because I outsource some of the difficult work. So thank you to the people that edit this and to Aggie, who organises a lot of things. So I've got pretty good at outsourcing stuff. But I just really enjoy the conversations. Like, I've made friends through it. Like, Rafe Kelly's a good mate of mine now through this. I catch up with friends through it. I've made new networks. It definitely helps me business-wise. And people come to the courses after listening to them. But what I like about it is it's a triple win. So the guests win, they get some free publicity to literally thousands of people now around the world. The audience wins. Obviously, they get free information from some of the top speakers in the world on this subject, which is just, I would have loved to have that available. I sometimes say EFC is the course that I would have liked to have done at 18, and the podcast is the information I would have liked to listen to. So, I give that to people. They're happy and I win as well. So everyone wins and it's fun and it's easy. So why the hell not?
What have been your strongest surprises in hosting this podcast?
I don't know. No huge surprises. Just certain guests are kind of more interesting than I thought they'd be. In certain guests, some guests feel like flat, not boring, but like a bit dead if they're not really like fully in the moment and listening and paying attention, if they're just giving a speech. So sometimes I'm surprised by who's a bit flat and who's a bit more alive. Like, some of them are much more in the moment and it's kind of juicy to listen to. And I've also had just a couple of people that knew nothing about them and then they ended up being really fucking cool. Like, like some people on the list, like, the first kind of 10 people were like good friends of mine, like Adrian and Miles and, people from EFC. And then as it started going on, I started reaching out on Facebook. And, I'm not sure I want to mention particular names. I've done a review podcast as well, which talks through some of the different aspects of the different guests. But there were certainly ones that I really, really enjoyed.
I guess also that now that you've done almost 100, this unique vantage point on, say, the landscape of somatics or embodiment practitioners internationally. What are you seeing right now? Is this a coherent field? Is this developing? Is it strong?
Yeah. So actually, just one more thing on the podcast before I go into the field was it's become a practice for me. Like, I'm not habitually a very good listener, and listening better. And apologies to those guests who I talked over and didn't listen to, like Julie Martin, I'm particularly apologetic to. I listened back to that one. I was a terrible listener, just really talked all over her. So sorry, Julie, if you're out there. But it's also been a practice for me of getting better at listening and staying connected. So it's become a somatic practice. And when I listen to every podcast I do back as I walk along the street, when it comes out a couple of months after recording usually, and I kind of feel my own embodied mood and the embodied mood of the person that was on the podcast. So that's an interesting practice I wanted to mention. But to come back to your question, in terms of the field, I think like one of my life's missions is really getting a sense of the field And I always keep finding new areas. Like I've been exploring Tantra, which I didn't know much about till fairly recently. And the movement culture people like Joseph and Rafe who came on, like Ido Patel kind of stuff, like that movement culture, that's a pretty new field to me. So it does open up new fields. I would say I'm pretty good now at like helping people who are like, well, I'm not sure what I want to do. It seems to me like the big challenge of the modern age is there's so much available. How do you decide? So this is where we need to move from pluralism to an integral approach where we can actually differentiate and have discernment and make distinctions and say, well, you might want to do Aikido with this person because of this, or you might want to do 5 rhythms, but this way with this person here. And I feel like I'm pretty good at helping people with that now, which I get a lot of satisfaction from. You know, it's a big part of EFC, obviously, is like choosing a practice. What are you going to do to develop yourself? And seeing how the practice is, because most people are just doing a practice pretty unconsciously because it's fun, or because they fell into it. So seeing how the practice is a practice of development, I feel like that's really grown for me. And I mean, it's having a point of, you know, always having multiple points of reference. And it can always drive me a bit nuts as well. Because if I'd be in a training, and I still do a lot of training, like I did a half-day Alexander technique training this week, for example, as a participant. And I drive myself a bit nuts because as soon as I hear anything, my brain just fucking cross-references it with like 100 different systems. So it's a little bit crazy making, and trying to turn that off is a challenge for me currently.
Yeah, so the kind of curating embodied, offering them to others.
Yeah, like if anyone ever wants to email me for a recommendation, you know, sometimes there's a coaching process necessary, but you know, normally I can kind of suggest a few things that might be helpful. And often I know people in that area. Like my network is ridiculous now through travel. You know, I've taught in about 40 or 50 countries. And it's really stupid. I've taught in nearly every European country and a bunch beyond Europe. And I have contacts all over the world. Like I'm just about to go on holiday to Japan, Australia, and New Zealand. And in each country, there's like 10 people that want to meet me and show me around, which is so cool. And that's all just my network and the reach. And they've been getting the podcast and the newsletter for 3 years. And, you know, so I mean, that network that's been built is massive. And it means I can quite often sort of refer people and connect people, which feels really good.
So listening to this and also the program of your next 5 years, what do you have a sense that you're cooking up for after these 5 years?
Well, I want to start an embodiment center. I want to settle down a little bit, and maybe it'll be time for kids then, you know, God willing, we'll see. And I want to be in one place and actually just train 200 people, like, you know, on an embodiment center where you have to have a year's membership and you can't drop in. It's like you're paid like a gym, you know, you're paid up for the year or not at all. And it will have 200 members. And I want there to be real community, because it seems to me the missing piece around a lot of embodied practice is community. And we have a good degree of that on EFC, but we still live in different places. So actually starting an embodiment center and then potentially exporting that model to other EFC students who want to start their own embodiment centers around the world, of community feels like the missing piece, not this American hyper-individualistic model, of actually, you know, really seeing the same people again and again and again in a place where you can do dance, yoga, Aikido, meditation, where it's all there. And the other piece that's opened up for me recently a bit more is nature. It just feels to me like doing all, like today is a bit of the one thing I don't like about my day today, because I'm doing this and 2 podcast interviews, is I'm indoors all day, you know? Like I do all my phone calls walking around the park now. And I'm thinking we probably do some kind of wild EFC at some point as well, where we do it all in the mountains with Sarah, who's this mountain leader girl, and Adrian, who's an eco-pagan. So community and nature are 2 things that are really opening up for me beyond just being, you know, the practice. But yeah, the centre, you know, I'm going to be getting a 10-year lease on a centre, probably in London. And that's where I see the future personally, is just working with those 200 people.
What's possible in terms of embodiment when you're in a dojo or that kind of sustained place, unique place, do you think? Yeah,
I mean, for me, the key thing is life integration. So at first I started with Aikido and I chased lots of extreme embodiment experiences, you know. And now my embodied practice is mostly about like resting when I'm tired and eating when I'm hungry. Like it's really simple. And my big challenge is now around stuff like not overworking myself or overeating. And like, embodiment for me is increasingly about the day-to-day. And I feel like an embodiment center where there's real community could encourage a integration of embodiment into the daily lives of people, because they could go there in the morning to meditate before work. They could meet a friend from there on their lunch break. And in the evening, they could do yoga. They could hang out in the bar afterwards. They could have their birthday party there. They could, meet a girl there and get together with someone. They could share childcare with other people there. For me, that's what a church had that a yoga studio doesn't have. Matthew Remsky speaks about this nicely. And I feel like that full integration into like life and life stages, that isn't easily done unless you're going to a place every day. And you need a good reason to go to a place every day. Do you know what I mean? It needs to have a bunch of stuff going on. Yeah, so that is what I think is possible. It doesn't, I could talk about like the far reaches of human potential, right? And that's kind of maybe more interesting in rock and roll. But what I'm most interested in is this kind of boring, integrating it into daily life.
Yeah. You've mentioned community, and relationships is one of the key, and the relational dimension is one of the key things you teach in your embodiment trainings. What have you most learned from embodied relationships in your life?
Yeah, the first thing is I'm not naturally a relational person. Like typologically, I'm super individualist. And, there's that saying, if you want to walk fast, go on your own, but if you want to walk a long way, go with others. I'm like, fuck that, I'll go on my own. Like that's always been my mentality. So if I'm talking about the importance of relationship, it really must be important, because I've learned it like the hard way, like you can't get away from it. Yeah, I've learned a lot in intimate relationships, a lot of trauma healing, and I just think there's a lot of wisdom to be found. Maybe I've just been lucky with the women I've been with. I'm not sure if men would be as informative. I don't know. But I've been very lucky with intimate relationships and how that's informed me. And just close colleagues. At the moment, I think friendship is underrated. So I've got great colleagues, and there's people like Frankie, who I really want to honor, who I've worked with a lot, Francis Bryers and Rachel Blackman, who I work with now, and, all the course managers that make things happen because they have skills like organization that I don't, like Catherine and Daniela. And Aggie, my secretary. So there's really honoring the differences between people so that you can make effective teams. I think that's massive. But for me at the moment, it's friendship, because having got amazing colleagues and amazing wife, it feels to me like friendship's the missing piece, particularly once you're out of your 20s. A lot of people don't have any friends. Like I think my mum and dad, they didn't have many friends. Do you know what I mean? My dad didn't have that many friends. He died, and it's like, you just lose track of people. And it's one of the big regrets of the dying. And another thing is it gets harder to have friends on your level, because, the people down the pub, even in Brighton, are not the people I really want to talk to. So I have a list on my phone now of 10 men and 1 woman who I call regularly. So later today, I'll be talking to Dave Rock, who was a guest on this podcast. And he's an Irish comedian and workshop leader. And I'm just making friends with him. And I mentioned Rafe, who's become like a real brother. And, Robert McNaughton from the Integral Centre I talked to last night. Adam Barley, Fire Rhythms teacher. Jamie Cato, my mate, who's ex-rock star, who does creativity stuff. Like there's sort of 10, Marcin, who from the EFC community. There's like 10 really good men who I just love being in contact with, and we're able to, I'm getting more and more annoyed with social media. I just don't see the point in it anymore. I either want to be podcasting to thousands of people or talking to one with someone on the phone. So I've kind of gone old school, and those relationships, like Alexandra Vilvoskaya in Russia, that's just she's one of my best friends. It's just a deep relationship now. I feel like that's the missing relational piece for a lot of people in this field, is having friends and peers.
So relationships as a deliberate practice, right?
Yeah, as a deliberate practice, and just in terms of like peer accountability. Like I might say to Adam, hey, Adam, can you recommend me a good marketing person? Or I might say, hey, I fell in love with this student. What do I do? Because I don't want to be unethical. Like no one tells you that stuff. And it might be like really high-end recommendations. I phoned my friend Shoshana the other day, and I wanted a trauma recommendation for my niece. And there's only a few people in the world I trust with that recommendation, but I think friendship as it's kind of in Buddhism, you'll see it, particularly in the Theravadan tradition, the spiritual friend, and just having a peer group. That seems, I mean, people put a lot of pressure on their romantic relationship, particularly if it's monogamous. And I feel like that's just the way we're kept disembodied and isolated, because it's just too much to put on one person. So yeah, they're to me the three pieces you need in life in terms of relationships, like great colleagues, great friends, and a great partner.
Okay, so in terms of relationships, one of the things you teach is polarities, and you've shared how the yin-yang in particular is one of the polarities you're playing with. What are you learning there?
Yin-yang is deep. I think it's one of the oldest models and one of the deepest models of embodiment. Obviously, on embodied yoga principles, it's absolutely key. In attraction workshops, whether I've been working with gay people in Moscow or straight people in other countries, it's absolutely huge. Until you understand yin and yang, it's even just like activity and rest, like tracking in the average day, like the activity you're doing and how you're resting, tracking the flow of a podcast conversation between speaking and listening. Yin and yang is in a way the most simple model, but because of that, it's the most fundamental. And then obviously we scale up to 4 elements to make it a little bit more complex, because that can be helpful sometimes. Like if doing a personality typology, that's a bit more useful to have more options than 2. But yin and yang is the most fundamental one. So I always say, like, awareness is the foundation of everything. Then you need to understand yin and yang, and then having a model like 4 elements is helpful. And then you can get much more complex than that, but that's kind of all you need.
So another thing I wanted to explore with you is your take on society, politics, and embodiment. One of the things that I find major in who you are is how you share that the body is political.
Yeah.
Could you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah. So the body politic is always at work. So we're always embodied in place and relationship, and that relationship includes politics. If you have a disempowered way of being, well, there's certain people that may benefit from that, like the status quo, for example, the powers that be. So we can't look at, say, personal trauma without looking at how that exists in a cultural context, social context, the family of origin, for example, but also the wider political context. Also, I'm absolutely driven nuts by this, because to me, embodiment suggests a certain politics. It suggests a politics of both care and personal responsibility. Typically, the conservatives like to claim personal responsibility and the left likes to claim care. So a truly embodied politics avoids the disembodiments of the right, which are like, sex is evil, sex is a sin, do what you're told, obey authority. You have to be disembodied to not listen to your own needs and to obey authority. But equally, there's a disembodiment of the left, which is about not self-regulating, which is terribly sensitive, which is in denial of basic biology, as far as I can tell these days. So there's forces of disembodiment on both the left and the right. And I like to speak to all of them. And that upsets everyone.
Yeah, you're quite known for being not politically correct and taking highly controversial stances. What would you say is the gift, and what may be the shadow of that?
Well, the gift is that I speak the truth when others don't dare. I mean, if you look at the phrase politically correct, it actually comes from Soviet Russia. And, it's really about people fearing for their lives, being asked to speak a certain way. And now people aren't in fear of their lives, but they are in fear of their careers and their social standing. I put a post up just last night, and it was pretty non-controversial as his opinion. It wasn't hardcore, and people are offended. People are unsubscribing. I lose customers on this all the time. So in the shadow is that it has a cost for me financially and in terms of friendships. There is venues in Brighton that won't rent to me. There are people that won't do body work with me. There are people that have barred me from being on their yoga courses. This is all just in the last few weeks. Because I sometimes express views, not Nazi views, just I have some centre conservative views, which are actually more integral than conservative, but that's hard to see from the outside. And perhaps more libertarian, you could even say. And I feel like this is a real problem in politics at the moment, that no one's listening to anyone, and people are kind of unfriending in real life, not just on Facebook these days. And that's a real problem. We can't agree to disagree. And actually, I think there's real truth in the left and the right. I've always been provocative. My dad was like that too. I think there's a real gift to that, and there is a shadow side to that. That sometimes I do it when I don't need to, or I talk to my therapist about it fairly regularly. Though it's not like I'm not self-regulating. I mean, what actually goes on inside my head is way worse than what I put on Facebook, Maud. I mean, if you're in my head for a day, you'd be blushing considerably. Like the things I don't say are way worse. And I mean, really, just in today's world, simply to speak common sense about certain subjects will make you a pariah and make people say, why are you being controversial? I'm like, I'm literally just speaking the truth. And it kind of annoys me a little bit, because if you look at my Facebook, like most of my posts are about just embodiment or cat pictures, or, there's maybe 1 in 10 that's even slightly provocative. But I think particularly in conflict-averse cultures like the UK and the kind of West Coast America, that really stands out to people. And I've become sort of almost archetypal to people, that they, I get these emails saying people are dreaming about me. Now, not in like a fantasy way, and I represent the part of them which would like to be more outspoken, I think. And most people are just living in terror of the social system. I have a particular gift in that my dad was essentially the village drunk. And what that is, a wonderful man, but he was a drinker, and that was really embarrassing as a child. And at a certain point, I just turned off shame. So I'm far less influenced by the terror of what other people think. And that makes me a great entrepreneur. It means I can be leading edge on things. And the danger, of course, is I isolate and alienate from everyone. But most people that work with me, they see that I have an extremely professional side. People are often surprised when they're in a workshop. I'm like, yeah, because I'm at work now, so I'm professional. I'm extremely rigorous about that. And there's a big heart there, which is most people will see once they get past the fact that I'm kind of fierce and swear and, stuff that really doesn't matter.
Mm. You've talked a little bit, Mark, about your relationship with the disembodied world, which is all around us. How do you think it's possible to engage constructively with it so that over time we can spread embodiment a little bit more?
Well, I mean, that's what my whole business has been about, right? Like a lot of that is basically sales and marketing. Is how do you make things attractive? How do you speak to benefits and talk in a language that people actually fucking speak and not some random ass hippie language? My book, ebook, Working in Business, a Guide for Hippies, is all about that. I mean, sometimes it's just putting on a suit, like it doesn't bother me to put on a suit. I don't wear a suit normally, but it don't hurt me. Equally, it might be putting on the combat trousers when I'm working in a charity in a war zone, So I feel like just having the openness and humility to be flexible, to speak other people's language, and to have the empathy. I mean, empathy is another big part of marketing, is that if you can empathize with people, you can speak to their concerns, right? Like what is interesting to them about this thing. So yeah, I personally, I find it's easy now. Like 10 years ago, it was a little harder. Now, because of mindfulness, emotional intelligence, Amy Cuddy, it's just got a lot easier. So I don't really struggle with it anymore.
Mark, more generally speaking, when you look at society currently from an embodiment or without an embodiment perspective, what makes your heart sing? What revolts you? What gives you hope?
What makes my heart sing? Young people loving Jordan Peterson and turning away from the madness of the authoritarian left. I just think it's just an epic win, because they haven't been sponsored, they've done it of their own accord. The internet makes my heart sing, because even though there's problems with being online all the time and blah blah, the amount of free information and learning anyone can get makes my heart sing in the world today. I mean, my own life is great. Like, I like where I live, I like who I live with, I like what I do, I'm healthy and happy. Do you know what I mean? Like, I feel like I'm winning, so that's personally a win. Even things that look bad, like Brexit and Trump, I kind of look at as signs of positive change in the long run. So those things don't freak me out. What was the question exactly? What in the world makes me happy?
What else revolts you or gives you hope, maybe?
Yeah, I don't know. I feel pretty positive about the world. Like Steven Pinker, it looks to me like things are getting better. Things have got easier to sell an embodiment. There's yoga everywhere. And even though it might revolt me, some of the flavors of that yoga, the fact that yoga's everywhere now is super cool, So I've been trying to infect yoga with the embodied yoga principles. So that gives me a lot of hope, even if I find some of the forms a bit revolting. Hashtag Instagram revolts me, but hashtag, embodiment on Instagram. That's the biggest, because I see it on my phone when I put my Instagram up. Mostly, though, I just see really good work being done all over the place, and I feel like, embodiment's kind of, it's trending in many ways, and it's growing as a field. So that looks positive to me.
Still in the spirit of step-by-step developing embodiment, what are the key practices you could share about how to stay embodied on the daily life? For instance, when you have a lot of computer work, or you can't always be in nature.
Yeah, I did a little post on this, embodiment in daily life. So obviously having a practice like yoga, Aikido, something is great, but that's not daily life. So for me, a simple thing I do is I stand up pretty regularly. Even when I'm being interviewed, I'll often stand up. I'll walk around. I'll take phone calls while walking in the little park near my house. I'll drink a lot of water. And that means, I notice the water, I notice my body, but then I have to go to the toilet fairly regularly. So it's a really simple little hack. I think being around other embodiment people really helps, because you're in that cultural field of being awareness of the body. Beauty really helps, like pleasure and beauty. Like, rather than making it hard work, it's just like, well, of course you want to be embodied when you're naked with your lover. Why would you not? Why would you miss the action, So I feel like, even just having a beautiful house, I have flowers regularly. I buy myself flowers in the house. Having a beautiful house is really important, in whatever way you can, according to your means, of course. You can still tidy up even if you're broke. That's what I used to do. Basically there are a few little embodiment tips. So another little one is you can just set your phone to go off 5 times a day. This is what we do on EFC now, is we realized the students were practicing, but they weren't always integrating it in their day. So we got them to do a little EFC day is a pretty good way to think about it, an EFC week actually. So at the beginning of the day, they'll do a little bit of meditation, a little bit of embodied yoga, even if it's just 10 minutes of each. Then they'll have these 5 alarms that will go off during the day. And then they'll have, at the end of the day, they'll do some journaling about the body, so embodied journaling. And then once a week, they'll have a call with me, once a teacher, once a week, they'll have a peer group call. And once a week, they'll go to a bigger practice. Even if they're busy, they can manage once a week usually. And that daily and weekly cycle we've designed to kind of give them the most hits and reminders of embodiment as they possibly can. And that seems to work pretty well.
We're entering now the random questions section of that interview. Mark, what is one embodied practice that you have never practiced and that maybe scares you a little bit or takes you out of your comfort zone?
Well, just yesterday I got the phone number of a dominatrix. So I've never been whipped by a professional dominatrix, though I did date a professional spanker. I've never been utterly dominated, because I tend to be quite a dominant person myself, and I'm considering going to this dominatrix as an embodied practice, not as a sort of even as a sexual thing.
Okay, so dominatrix aside, who's one person you would dream to work with? A client, business partner?
Bonnie Bainbridge-Cohen is up there in terms of the greats. Anna Halprin, who you were dancing with recently, I think would be up there.
Yes.
I've tracked down most of the people I want to work with at some point. There's certainly people I'd like to see more of. Dylan from my generation, let me big up Dylan Newcomb as well, of Uzazu. Like, he's someone I really rate of my generation. Like, I'm going to be hosting him in the UK in November because I really rate him and I want to learn from it. It's not a financial motivation at all. I just want to big him up, because I feel like it's easy to talk about the greats, but it's like, who else of my generation I really rate, and he's one.
So Mark, when you have completed your life purpose and embodiment is mainstream and you're basically out of a job, what will be your next dream work?
After that, I have kind of a dream that I might become a monk. I promised Daria that I would outlive her, which is difficult because she's 10 years younger, but she eats a lot of chocolate and stuff, so maybe it's going to happen. And then I might become a monk at the end of my life. That's possible. I quite like the idea of being a stand-up comedian. I'm doing a little bit of training in that at the moment. And another embodied practice I've never done is parkour, which my friend Rafe does, which I'd like to do more of. And I can't run. I've got this weird thing where I can't run. Long story. But just physically I can't run. Most people have a fight-flight response. I just have a fight response. And
climbing up trees, you can do that?
Yeah, I can climb trees. Yeah, I can swim and I can dance, but not running. So maybe parkour, to go back to your earlier question. And at the end of my life, I'd be happy to be a gardener again. I used to do gardening when I was younger. It's for money. I quite like the idea of just being an old guy in a garden drinking tea.
And Mark, last question. One question I didn't ask you, but would be great that I did.
Oh, I see. You're asking me the question you should have asked me. This could get pretty meta, Maud. What do I hate?
Anything else you want to share?
I might steal that. That's a great question. That is a great question. You could ask me what I hate about embodiment, because most people just big up the side of what they love. I have no idea how to answer that. What's my lead edge practice-wise?
What is your lead edge practice-wise?
That's the life integration. I'm enjoying Feldenkrais a lot recently. I'm going to be in Hombu Dojo in Japan doing Aikido again soon, so I've got a sort of resurgence of practicing that after not practicing it much for the last year or two. And the embodied yoga always excites me. That is just I'm currently writing the book on that, and that's just a really good system, if I do say so myself. So that excites me a lot, just because it's my film guy in Russia, Sergey, who's filmed me for 3 years, do pretty much everything that I do. He just said casually, that's the most powerful thing you do, because it's so concentrated. So that excites me a lot. That's why I put a lot of energy into it, even though there's not much money in the yoga world. That excites me a lot. But in personal practice, Feldenkrais, like that's rocking my world right now.
Super. Okay, bonus question now, Mark.
Yeah.
What's your intention or your dream for the next 100 editions of this Embodiment podcast?
Yeah, I'm just going to keep doing it till I'm bored of it. And at the moment, it's pretty much nearly always interesting. So I figure if it's interesting to me, it'll probably be interesting to other people. I would love to get more guests from countries other than the UK or the United States. So I'd love to have more European guests, for example. I mean, you're the second Frenchie we've had on. We've had one Spaniard, one Italian, one German, a couple of Swedish and Norwegian. It's hard to find guests from other countries, one Dutch. Also, I want to keep it culturally diverse. Maybe explore some of the practices I know less about more, like I have been doing with Tantra, by having Tantra guests on. I figure as long as I'm interested, other people are probably going to be interested. There's a few sort of big name people I want on. I feel like now that it's pretty established, that will become easier to find. So, if anyone's out there listening and any of the kind of really, Peter Levine or any of the super famous people or whatever, then encourage them to come on. So it's a genuine triple win, so I don't feel like I have to sell it. It's funny when I approach people, some people get like, why should I come on? Other people who are like straight away want to come on. It really brings up stuff from people about, I had a few people refuse to come on who I know it will benefit their business and it's not personal to me. And I'm like, I find that hard to understand. I guess they find it harder to kind of be recorded, or it really brings up stuff for people. So that's another interesting aspect of it. I'm super extroverted, so for me, maybe it's, maybe I'm just being unempathic with the people that don't want to shout so loudly.
Mark, it's been a delight being with you on that edition of the podcast. Thank you so much.
Maud,
and may the force be with you.
Maud, merci beaucoup. People should also check out Maud. She's doing leadership embodiment stuff and a whole bunch of interesting practices based out of Austria, originally from Paris. So Maud, let me give you a boost as well as one of my top students and collaborators.
Thanks very much, Mark.
Real pleasure. Thanks for your time.
Goodbye.
If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe to get more. If you'd like to help us build the Embodied Tribe, leave a review on iTunes or share this on your social media. If you're interested in training globally, sign up to receive the newsletter at embodiedfacilitator.com. Until next time, welcome home to the body.